So let's talk about the exposure triangle for a little bit. I suggest that you watch this video, then go back and watch the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO videos, and then come back to this one. This will make a little bit more sense once you understand a little bit more about the individual settings. So here's the exposure triangle. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO each comprise one leg of the triangle. In aperture, you can go from a brighter picture to a darker picture. You can go from shallow depth of field to wide depth of field. With shutter speed, you go from brighter to darker, and you go from revealing motion to stopping motion. And with ISO, as you go from a darker picture at ISO 100 to a brighter picture at ISO 3200, you go from less noise and a smoother look to the picture to a grainier, grittier look as well. And with the exposure triangle, we talk about a lot of stop equivalencies. F-stops, shutter speeds, and ISOs are all defined in one-stop increments, although most cameras today come from the factory set to 1/3 of a stop with each click on the dial. A one-stop change equals either 100% more exposure or 50% less exposure. And you can make that change from any of the three legs. Now, where this takes flight in practice is that means you can start trading exposure settings between the different legs for creative effect. Where I would use this in the field, for example, is if I need a faster shutter speed to freeze action, I can open up my aperture, or I can make my ISO higher to make it more sensitive. Alternatively, if I'm shooting a landscape and I need lots of depth of field, again, I can slow my shutter speed down, or I can raise my ISO, or some combination. Here's an example. For example, if we want more depth of field and we start at ISO 400, a 2/50th of a second at f8, we can leave the ISO where it is, slow the shutter speed down one stop, and change the aperture from f8 to f11, and we get an equivalent exposure between the two different pairs of settings. And again, watch those aperture, shutter speed, ISO videos as to why you might want to make those creative changes. Here's a list of typical full stop numbers with shutter speeds, f-stops, or apertures. And I suggest you pause the video here and print the previous slide, and then hit resume when you're ready. I'll wait for you. I'll still be here. And we're back. Let's do some exposure horse trading. So have your camera and the slide a couple of slides ago in hand as you do these exercises. It'll make your life easier. So if we start at f5.6, which one of these choices represents a one-stop change from f5.6? One stop. I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about it. Still thinking? All right. So answers B and C are both a one-stop change from 5.6. So if we just take them in order, f2.8 is 2 stops brighter. F4 is a one stop brighter. F8 would be 1 stop darker. F22 is 4 stops darker, and F0.95 is 5 1/3 stops brighter. And yes, that is a real f-stop. If you want to buy a 50mm f0.95 lens, B&H will sell you one for about $8,000 or $10,000. try another one. Starting at a 1/125th of a second, which one of these shutter speeds represents a 3-stop change? And again, I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about it. All right, let's have a look at the answers. So our answers are C and D are each 3 stops different, C being 3 stops brighter, D being 3 stops darker. So you can take your stop change and go either direction and have it be a 3-stop change. So in this particular case, if we start at a 1/125th of a second, a 1/250th is 1 stop darker, 1/60th is 1 stop brighter, 1 full second is 7 stops brighter. And you can do the math. You can have shutter speeds that go as long as you want to stand there and hold the camera open. Let's look at the ISO side of things. So if we start at ISO 400, which one of these represents a 2-stop change? Again, let's think about this for maybe 30 seconds. All right, we're back. So A, ISO 1600 represents a 2-stop change from 400. So we go ISO 400, double that to 800, double that to 1600, and there's your 2 stops. 3200 is a 3-stop change because it's 1 stop dark or brighter still than 1600. ISO 200 is half of 400, so it's 1 stop darker. ISO 50 is 3 stops darker than 400. ISO 12,500 would be, well, let's do the math. 400 to 800, 8 to 1600, 16 to 3200, 3200 to 6400, 6400 to 12,500, and we're at 5 stops. Which one of these, let's put it all together, is a 1-stop change if we start at F8, 1/125th of a second, and ISO 200. Let's think about this one for a little while. Use pencil and paper if it's helpful. Use the click stops on your camera if it's helpful. All right, this is kind of a real-world problem. This is the sort of thing you actually go through in the field. If your picture's, say, a little bit dark, you need to make it 1 stop brighter. What's an equivalent set of settings? So let's look at choice A. We go from F8 to F5.6. Okay, yes, that's a change, and it's 1 stop brighter. But we also go from a 1/25th to a 2/50th. And that's also a 1-stop change, but it's 1 stop darker. And the ISO stays the same. So this is simply an even trade. We're getting a little bit more faster shutter speed. So we have a little bit less depth of field and less motion for an equivalent exposure. And this is a very realistic trade to make in the field. So we're going to answer B, which is our correct answer. We go from F8 to F5.6. That's 1 stop brighter. Our shutter speed and our ISO stay the same. So this is a change in exposure of 1 stop. Let's look at answer number C just for grins. We stay at F8. Our shutter speed goes from a 1/125th to 1/500th, and that's a 2-stop change, making the picture 2 stops darker. Our ISO doesn't change, so our net result is 2 stops darker. If we look at answer D, we go from f8 to f16. That's 2 stops darker. Our shutter speed stays the same, our ISO stays the same. So again, we're 2 stops darker. So the correct answer to this one is back to answer B. Let's do a couple more of these. Let's look at a 2-stop change from f4 and 1/8 of a second and ISO 1600. Which one of these is a 2-stop change? All righty. Well, we'll start with the f-stops. We go from f4 to f5.6 in answer A. Is that a change? Yes, it is. How much of a change? It's 1 stop, and it's 1 stop darker. 1/8 of a second to 1/8 of a second is no change, and the ISO stays the same. So our net change here is 1 stop darker. Looking at answer B, our f-stop goes from 4 to 5.6, so that's a 1 stop darker change. Our shutter speed stays the same, but our ISO goes from 1600 to 6400, which is a 3-stop brighter change, or a 2-stop brighter change. So 1 stop darker on the f-stop, 2 stops brighter on the ISO, and our net change is 1 stop brighter. Looking at answer C, our f-stop stays the same. Our shutter speed goes from 1/8 to 1/15th, which is 1 stop darker, and our ISO stays the same. So our net change is 1 stop darker. Not there yet. Looking at answer D, our f-stop stays the same. Our shutter speed goes from 1/8 to 1/125th, and that's a 4-stop change. We go from 1/8 to 1/15th to 1/30th to 1/60th to a 1/125th, and there's your 4 stops. Our ISO stays the same, making this a 4-stop darker change. Looking at answer E, our f-stop goes from 4 to 5.6. That's 1 stop darker. Our shutter speed stays the same. And our ISO goes from 1600 to 800, which is another 1 stop darker change. So we have a net change here of 2 stops. Okay, and these are general real-world kinds of problems, and this is a piece of the exposure that you need to be able to manipulate in the field as you look at your picture and you say, I don't have enough depth of field, how do I fix it? I don't have a fast enough shutter speed to stop my hands from shaking the camera, how do I fix it? This is where you're going to fix it, is by trading f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO until you get settings that work for you. A couple of things that I find helpful. Canon has a wonderful little exposure simulator that they have set up. You can pick your shutter speed, your ISO, your f-stop, and take a virtual picture and see what the effects are of those changes. The other thing I have found helpful, especially for those of you that like to play around with manual exposure, is actually using a handheld light meter. My favorite is the Pocket Light Meter by New Waste Studio. If you don't mind ads, I think it's free. I think it's a whole 99 cents to get rid of the ads. It should be available for both iPhones and Androids. I'm an iPhone person, so works great there. What I like about it is that it shows me my f-stop, my shutter speed, my ISO choices, and it also shows me the color temperature that I'm working with, which can be helpful for setting white balances. We've also used one called Light Meter, spelled LGHTMTR. That's another free choice. I don't think it's quite as precise in terms of the area that it reads, but what do you want for nothing? So these are some of the things with the exposure triangle that you should go out and play around with and just get some comfort level with.